Yeah, Revelation is telling you something. Now that's like the French soldiers. The French are lovers, not fighters, right? So during the Second World War, it was said that the French soldiers were at the front line, and one of the sergeants said, "Right, lads, over the top," and nobody moved. Said, "Right, lads, over the top," and nobody moves. Says it for a third time, and then the French, loving the opera, one of the French guys turns around to the other and says, "Oh, what a wonderful voice he has. What a wonderful voice," right? In other words, you could hear what he was saying, but not heed it, not do it. You can hear, but not do. And the problem with preaching today, for me, one of the fundamental problems, is that we're trying to convince people's minds. We're trying to get people to affirm certain ideas and ideals. And what happens? We create an ironic church. Now, this is central, so I really want to go for this, right? Irony. What is irony? There's that story about the minister who's sitting in her house and she's just reading a book. And one of the parishioners knocks on the door, right? She opens the door and he's a big guy and he's sweating. And it's obviously he's run all the way to the house. He's in tears. And he says to the woman, "Listen, there's a family live just down the road. The guy lost his job in the recession. She's looking after 3 kids. Their mother stays with them. But they don't have enough money for the rent. They've got no money at the moment. And the landlord's going to kick them out of the house. Even though they're only 1 day late, as soon as they get late, he's just going to kick them out on the street. And it's the middle of winter. We've got to do something. Please, let's do something," right? So the minister says, "Yes, we'll go and we'll get some money." And then just in passing, she says, "Oh, how do you know them?" He goes, "Oh, I'm the landlord," right? That's the ironic gesture, right? We are absolutely concerned, "Oh, we've got to do something." And then actually, it's what you're doing that's creating the problem in the first place. And yet, your concern, it masks that. Now, the reason why the anecdote works is because the guy doesn't feel it as a problem. Now, of course, there are landlords who feel guilty. "Oh, I need to make the money. I want to look after them." But this landlord doesn't feel the irony, right? The irony literally means doing an action which one disavows. So if you go to a 70s disco, you dress in the 70s clothes, you dance to the 70s music while slagging off or disavowing. You don't know slagging, do you? While what's the word for slagging? Dissing, there you go. While dissing the music and dissing the clothes that you're wearing, okay? So you actually engage in the very activity that you're disavowing. How many of us sit in Starbucks and talk about the evils of corporations? How many of us, drive fuel-consuming cars while listening to radio programs about the environment? We engage in this ironic gesture all the time, and we don't experience it. We can all talk about how having a bigger car won't be good for our soul or the environment. Having a bigger house isn't going to make us happier. Having lots of money won't satisfy a longing in our hearts. What's the problem? As soon as we walk away from the conversation, we act as if having a bigger car and a better car is better for our soul and the environment. We act as if having a bigger house will make us happier. We act as if having more money will satisfy the longing in our soul. And convincing you is not the problem. You have to convince the social self. This is captured beautifully in the story of the guy who he thinks he's seed. He literally thinks he's pieces of seed on the ground, right? And he goes to an analyst. And after 3 years of analysis, finally he goes, "Hold on, I'm not seed on the ground, I'm a human being," right? So he's really happy, a lot of analysis, a lot of money, but he's really happy, I'm a human being. He goes away, and 3 weeks later he's back at the analyst's door, knocking at the door frantically. The guy opens the door. Man's sweating, he obviously hasn't eaten for days, looks like he hasn't slept in weeks. The analyst goes, "What's wrong?" And the guy goes, "My next door neighbour's got chickens." He says, "Why? What's the problem with that?" He says, "I'm terrified they're going to eat me." And the analyst goes, but you know you're not seed. You know you're a human being. And he goes, "I know I'm a human being, but do the chickens know?" Right? Now, the problem with preaching is we're trying to convince me that I'm a human being. I know I'm a human being. We have to convince the chickens. Preaching should be convincing the chickens, not me. In other words, I know I should be nicer to the poor. I know I should be more loving to my parents. I know I should be doing more good in my life. You don't need to tell me that. You need to convince the chickens. You need to convince. And what are the chickens? What are the chickens? Do you want to ask that?
Peter,
Oh, sorry.
what are the chickens?
Brilliant. I'm glad you asked that question. The chickens are, it's like fashion. You go like, I know fashion's shallow. I know that. You don't need to convince me. You need to convince the advertisers. You don't need to convince me that having a bigger car won't make me happy. You need to convince the magazines that I read. In other words, what we do, basically, and I might talk about this more depth tomorrow, is that we disavow our beliefs. We place them somewhere else. So I go, fashion shallow, absolutely fashion shallow. But because of the magazines I read, I actually, in my embedded actions, I continue to affirm the fashion's not shallow. I engage in irony. And for me, preaching, this is what transformance art is. Transformance art is trying to convince, not you, it's to convince the chickens. It's to convince your deeper self, what's called your social self, what you do. Right, Batman's a perfect example. Okay, right, look at Batman. Okay, what does he do at night? He puts on this crazy rubber suit and he goes out and he beats up criminals, right? Then, after he's beaten up the criminals, he gets into a suit the next day, and he goes and he works in Wayne Industries. Okay? Now, as Bruce Wayne. Now, what's really interesting is, right, he's doing this big stuff on Saturday night, beating up on the bad guys, trying to make Gotham City a better place. And yet, during the day, he's working in an industry which makes so much money that he can fund a high-tech military campaign and nobody even notices. How much money is Wayne Industries making? Wayne Industry is making phenomenal amounts of money. And one has to ask, is it not industries like Wayne Industries who are making such vast amounts of money without any social regard? Is that not the reason why there are criminals that he has to beat up? Has he not made the connection that the very thing he's doing on Monday to Friday is the very thing he's fighting on Saturday night? Okay, now, this is really important, right? We think that the site of resistance, he thinks the site of resistance is going out and beating up criminals, but he doesn't realize that what he's doing in his grounded daily activity is creating and generating the very conditions that means he has to do that. There's loads of things we can say here. What happens is the very thing he thinks is the site of resistance is the very thing he has to do in order to feel good about himself so he can get the suit on and go into work the next day. Now, take The Matrix, for example. The Matrix is another beautiful example of this. The first Matrix film, all these Christians watched it and thought, this is like Christianity. Neo's like the Messiah. The guys, Zion is like, heaven, and, the revolutionary fighters and all of this. Great. But what do we find out? Well, as the series goes on, we find out that actually the machines allowed Neo to exist. In fact, Neo's just the latest in a long line of messiahs. And actually the freedom fighters, the machines all let them do their thing. And the machines built Zion, or at least let Zion exist. And so what you find out is the very place that you thought was the site of resistance in the first film, you realize is the very thing that the system requires in order to continue to run smoothly. Now, that's why the second and third films work, even though they're kind of rubbish, right? It kind of works theoretically. What we think is, we think what we're doing on a Sunday morning is a site of resistance, or on a Tuesday night at our prayer meetings, or working for the poor on a Thursday evening. That's the site of resistance. That's the site in which we're kind of expressing the kingdom of God. Well, what if that's the very thing that the world needs in order to continue to allow us to run smoothly? We need our little air vent. It's like in work, you slag off your boss, behind your closed doors. You think that's a bad thing? No. That's the very air vent that allows you, as long as you turn up at 9 o'clock in the morning and work till 5, well, boss doesn't care if you slag him off. You still care, you're still there, you're still working away. And so the very site that you think is a site of resistance, the slagging off of your boss, is the very thing that your boss needs to keep you a nice, good citizen. That's why we're all allowed to go a little bit over the speed limit. Because you don't want to oppress people too much. You need to create air valves. Little places. And so the air valves actually prevent us from having real change. The church should be insurrectionary, right? We are about radical change. That's what conversion means. That's what conversion is about. Not convincing the mind, about reconfiguring the entire social self, becoming the actual site of resistance.